thanks for meeting with me today. I would love to hear a bit about the assessment and reporting approaches that you used in your Year 7 Ecosystems unit.
Of course, this was a 6-week Year 7 science unit focused on classification, food webs, ecosystem relationships, and environmental management. So the unit was designed to develop students' scientific understanding and communication skills. The summative task requires students to research a First Nations environmental practice, present their findings, and complete a written scientific report.
Sounds good. Why did you decide to use both presentation and written report?
That's a good question. So when I look at the unit as a whole, I realized that students had spent most of the 6 weeks developing scientific writing skills. Almost every week they were writing something. Because of that, I decided that the written report should carry the greater weighting. I weighted the written report as 70% and the presentation at 30%. The report also assessed a broader range of rubric criteria than just the presentation. So through the report, the students need to organize their ideas into a structured scientific explanation. Presentation was still important because communicating scientific ideas was one of the learning outcomes.
That makes sense. You mentioned in the unit plan that you had an EALD students. Tell me a little bit more about the adjustments you made.
Yeah, absolutely. So one student I was particularly thinking about when planning the assessment was Lily. She was one of my EALD students. She's still developing confidence with academic English. When I was designing a task, I wanted to make sure that she could access the assessment without changing the learning outcomes. For example, I would provide vocabulary lists containing key scientific terms such as ecosystem, biodiversity, habitat, and environmental management. I would also use visual codes, label diagrams, sentence starters, and structured writing templates throughout the unit. So before the presentation, Lily was given opportunities to rehearse her ideas and receive feedback. I would also check in with her regularly during lessons to make sure that she understood the task requirements.
Okay, so how did you make sure the assessment was actually valid?
So for me, validity came back to alignment. I wanted to make sure that what I was assessing matched what I had actually told throughout the unit. For example, so one of the learning outcomes requires students to explain ecosystem relationships and environmental management practices. So students demonstrate that through the written report, and those skills were assessed through the rubric I developed. Because the learning outcomes, achievement standards, assessment task, and rubric was closely aligned, so I feel pretty confident that I did that.
And what about reliability?
So one thing I was quite careful about was consistency in marking. I wanted marking to be as consistent as possible. So to support reliability, I developed a detailed analytic rubric with clear achievement descriptors from E to A, as I can show here. The rubric provided specific criteria for scientific understanding, cause and effect reasoning, scientific vocabulary, communication, and presentation skills. I also collected multiple sources of evidence across the unit. So for example, I looked at class activities, fieldwork tasks, written work, and classroom observations alongside the summative assessment. So I think using multiple sources of evidence help strengthen the reliability of my judgment. Also, where possible, I would also participate in moderation process with my colleagues by discussing the rubric and reviewing sample student work.
Okay, and fairness?
Fairness was something I thought about throughout the whole unit. So students come into the classroom with different strengths, backgrounds, and learning needs. So I wanted to make sure that everyone had an opportunity to demonstrate what they knew. So for students who needed additional support, including Lily, my EALD student, I provided visual scaffolds, etc., as I've already mentioned. And at the same time, the learning outcomes and achievement standards remain unchanged because the goal was to provide equitable access to learning and assessment.
Could you talk me through how you record and report student achievement?
Sure. So I collected both formative and summative evidence throughout the unit. The checklist was used to record participation, cooperation, and developing confidence in scientific vocabulary. The summative evidence included the final presentation, written report, and completed rubric. Students' results were recorded in a spreadsheet, and assessment records were maintained for each student. The spreadsheet was organized according to the unit learning outcomes and achievement standards so that assessment evidence could be linked directly to curriculum expectations. Classroom observations were also documented as in a spreadsheet because they provided additional evidence of student engagement and progress.
How did you manage data security?
All digital records were stored in password-protected school systems and were only accessible to authorized staff members for assessment purposes.
Great. Is there anything else you would like to add?
Just one final point. So for me, assessment is not simply about assigning grades. Assessment data was also used to inform future learning and identify areas requiring future support. So overall, the assessment design, adjustments, and reporting processes were intended to provide valid, reliable, and fair evidence of student achievement while supporting the diverse needs. The evidence collected throughout the unit was then used to provide clear and meaningful reporting to our stakeholders.
Excellent. Thanks for walking me through that.
No problem at all. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for meeting with me today.
Thank you for coming today. I'd like to discuss Lily's progress during our Year 7 Ecosystem unit and share some examples of her work and the progress she has made throughout the term.
Thank you. I did read the report before coming today. To be honest, I noticed that Lily received mostly B's, and I was a little surprised because she spends a lot of time studying at home. I was hoping you could help me understand how she's going in science.
Of course. So before we look at the assessment results, I'd like to share a few things I have noticed about Lily in class. So this is her observation sheet, and one thing I really appreciate is that Lily is always willing to help other students. For example, during one of our science lessons, a student sitting next to her missed part of the instructions for an activity. And before I had a chance to come over and help, Lily had already helped her write it down. So those small things might not appear on the report card, but they tell me that Lily is respectful and contributes positively to the classroom environment.
That's really nice to hear. She's usually quite shy at home, so I'm actually surprised she helps other students.
Yeah, she can be quiet at times, but she's definitely becoming more confident. Another example I remember was during our food web lesson. So we were discussing producers and consumers, and Lily volunteered an answer to explain why plants are producers. So she was brave enough to come up to the whiteboard. So moments like that show growing confidence in both science and academic English.
That sounds good, but I still keep looking at the report and wondering why she didn't get an A.
That's a very reasonable question. Lily is a hardworking student and she has made strong progress throughout the unit. However, assessment grades are based on specific achievement standards and evidence of learning. Let me show you some examples of her work and I can explain how those judgments were made.
Okay.
So this is Lily's presentation about cultural burning. This assessment was designed to address the learning outcomes from our ecosystems unit, particularly students' understanding of ecosystems relationships and environmental management. One thing she did particularly well was selecting relevant images that support her explanations. And the images here clearly connected to the environmental management practices discussed in the task. And let me find, this is her written explanation. In this section, she explains that cultural burning can reduce the risk of large bushfires and help protect habitats. She also correctly used scientific vocabulary such as ecosystem, biodiversity, habitat, and environmental management. These examples show that she understands many of the key concepts we covered during the unit.
I can see that. Honestly, when I read this report, it looked pretty good to me. She explained the ideas and used scientific vocabulary. So why wasn't this an A?
Yeah, that's a fair question. So let's look at the rubric together. The rubric was provided to students before they completed the assessment, and student achievement was assessed across several criteria, as you can see here, including scientific understanding, explanation of relationships, scientific vocabulary, communication, and presentation skills. So based on the evidence collected, Lily achieved a B for scientific understanding because she explained some of the ecosystem relationships. She also achieved a B for scientific vocabulary because she used a range of scientific terms appropriately throughout her work.
But if everything's correct, why isn't that an A?
That's a very important question. So the difference between a B and an A is often not whether the information is correct. So the difference is usually the depth of explanation. So for example, Lily wrote that cultural burning affects plants and animals. That statement is correct. However, an A-level response would go further than that and explain exactly how and why those effects occur. So, for example, an A-level response, like here, might explain how cultural burning reduces fuel loads, how that reduces the risk of severe bushfires, and how those changes affect biodiversity and the ecosystem's health over time. So Lily identified those ideas, but she did not always explain the cause and effect relationships in enough details.
I think I understand. So she understands the topic, but she isn't analyzing it deeply enough.
Exactly. So when I look at her work, I can see a sound understanding of the content. So the next step is developing more detailed scientific explanations and making stronger connections between ideas.
Can I ask something else? Do you think English is affecting her results? Because at home she understands the science when we talk about it in Chinese, but sometimes she struggles to explain herself in English.
I think language does present some challenges at times, particularly when students are expected to explain complex scientific ideas in writing and during presentations. So that is why I provided several adjustments throughout the unit for my ELD students. So for example, Lily received vocabulary lists, visual supports, structure writing templates, and opportunities to rehearse before her presentation. And these supports help her access the task successfully.
That makes sense. I think she sometimes feels disappointed because she works really hard and still doesn't get the highest result.
I completely understand that. What I would emphasize is the progress she has made. So at the beginning of this unit, it often relied heavily on short answers and find some scientific vocabulary challenging. And by the end of the unit, she was confidently using terms such as biodiversity, habitat, and ecosystem in both her presentation and her written work. The grade is important, but I think the progress she has made is equally important.
So what should she focus on if she wants to achieve an A next time?
There are two main areas. So the first is developing deeper cause and effect explanations rather than simply stating that something affects an ecosystem. She needs to explain how and why those changes occur. And the second area is oral communication. During her presentation, she relied quite heavily on reading from her slides. The more confident she becomes speaking independently, I think the stronger her communication skills will become.
Is there anything we can do at home to help?
Absolutely. So one helpful strategy would be encouraging Lily to explain her learning verbally. So for example, after completing homework, she could explain a scientific concept in her own words to you or other family members. Reading short science texts together and discussing new vocabulary can also help build confidence with academic language.
Thank you. I think seeing the rubric and the examples helps me understand the results much better. I was mainly focused on the grade, but I can see the progress you're talking about.
You're very welcome. Overall, Lily has made positive progress throughout the unit. She has demonstrated a solid understanding of ecosystems and environmental management, and I'm very pleased with the effort she has shown throughout the term. With continued support in developing scientific explanations and confidence in oral communication, I believe she will continue to achieve stronger results in science.